Okay, thank you everybody for joining our talk. Last week, you'll remember we talked about the background to the life of the Buddha, the world in which he lived and taught and influenced and was influenced by. And tonight I want to talk about the life of the Buddha. And I want to make it clear in the beginning that I'm talking about the life of the Buddha as is mentioned in the Pali Tipitaka. In other words, we're only going to look at what the Pali Tipitaka says about the life of the Buddha, what he was, who he was, and what he did. And the reason for this is because there's a great deal of argument about the authenticity of the Pali Tipitaka and what have you, but I'm going to argue that it is, whatever people say, it is the oldest record that we have of the Buddha and his teachings. And if it is the oldest, or being the oldest, it is closer to his time than any other literature, and therefore we can say it is the most authentic. That's not to say that everything in the Pali Tipitaka is valid and reasonable and true, but I think a very good deal of it is. Now, when we're talking about the life of the Buddha, we're immediately confronted by a problem, and that problem is that there was no writing in India at that time. Probably writing began and became widespread about 100 or 130 years after the Buddha. Now, when you don't have written records, then of course you have to rely on oral tradition. And we know, because many studies have done, that the oral tradition is very unreliable. They say that each time the narrator narrates his story, whatever it is, it changes. And that is certainly true, but that is not true in relation to ancient India. Last week, we talked about the Vedas, and we know that the Vedas date from perhaps 900 to about 1,300 years after the Buddha. And all authorities, all Indologists, Sanskrit scholars agree that those Vedas have been transmitted orally with such a high degree of accuracy. And we know that they were not written till about the 11th or the 12th century AD, meaning that they were transmitted orally with a high degree of accuracy for nearly 2,000 years. Incidentally, the reason they weren't written was they were considered secret. That's the reason why. The other reason is after the Brahmin class developed or evolved a complex system of which allowed them to remember and to pronounce with extraordinary accuracy the Vedas, they felt, and probably they were right, that their oral way of preserving the ancient and the sacred texts was actually more reliable than writing them down. And that's almost certainly true. Today, we think that writing is more accurate than remembering something. But that's because we have electronic ways of reproducing what we write. In ancient times, of course, they didn't do that. In ancient times, if you wanted a copy of a book, you had to sit down and copy it out yourself or pay somebody else to do it. And all you have to do is look at any ancient written records, including the Bible and other ancient documents, and they are full of mistakes when you compare one with another. Why? Well, you imagine sitting down and writing the whole Bible by hand. Chances are you might leave out whole lines. You might get words wrong, etc. So on the other hand, in a world where the Brahmin priests had only one job, which is to chant and commit to memory the Vedas, and where they weren't distracted by all the distractions that we have in the modern world, they had evolved memories to an extraordinary degree of accuracy. And we know that at least 35% of the Buddha's disciples, male disciples, were Brahmins. So it seems very likely that they brought to their new religion, that is Buddhism, they brought to their new religion the skills, the technologies of preserving literature orally. And of course, when you read the Tipitaka, you can immediately see that it is in a style not to be read so that you're inspired, as for example, the Psalms in the Bible or the Book of Job or something that. When you read them, you're uplifted and you're inspired. Pali literature is not written to inspire. It's written to put it into your memory. Anybody who's read them will know, well, the first thing you notice is the repetitions. It repeats and repeats and repeats the same thing again and again. And why does it do that? Because the best way to remember something is to repeat it again and again. And there are other things. There are things like rhyming verses, stereotyped passages and what have you. All of this shows, or they were techniques edited into the text so that they could be remembered with a high degree of accuracy. And I think that it is correct to say that the Pali Tipitaka is not only a collection of documents which are closest to the time of the Buddha, but that they reflect very much things that the Buddha may very well have said and done. And on this subject, I would like to recommend to you this new book by Venerable Sujato and Venerable Brahmali, which is one of the best books on Buddhism, I would say, written in the last 30 years. They argue very cogently and in great detail for the accuracy of the majority, or what you might call the core material in the Pali Tipitaka. I think it is a remarkable work, and I think every Buddhist who is interested in whether or not the Pali Tipitaka is what it says is valid and authentic should read that book. Okay, so that's the first thing. So how do we know about the Buddha? Where do we get this information from? Well, the first detailed biography of the Buddha, biographies of the Buddha were written between about the 1st and about the 3rd centuries AD. Sorry, 1st century BC up to about 2nd or 3rd century AD. And the two most famous and popular of these were the Lalita Vistara, which is in Sanskrit, and the Buddha Charita. And these two works are many of the legends and stories that everybody knows about the Buddha, but which are not in the Tipitaka, generally come from these two books, mainly the Lalita Vistara. Now, when you read the Lalita Vistara, the first thing you notice is it's just filled with the most extravagant miracles. The Buddha is portrayed as somebody who floats through the air. He doesn't walk from one place to the other. Everywhere he goes, he's surrounded by a cluster of devas. It's really over the top. It's really over the top. When you read the Buddha Charita, on the other hand, which is also a work in Sanskrit, this was written by Ashvaghosha, maybe in about the 2nd century AD. This is a much more sober attempt to write a biography of the Buddha, whereas the Lalita Vistara is a fantastic document. The Buddha Charita is much more realistic. The Buddha is certainly portrayed as an extraordinary person, but very much as a human being. And it seems that throughout Buddhist history, you've had these two trends, if you like. On the one hand, glorifying the Buddha until he is a miracle worker, and on the other hand, a more sober account, trying to present the Buddha as a human being, an extraordinary human being, but a human being nonetheless. So most of what people read and think they know about the Buddha come from these two documents. When we look in the Pali Tipitaka, The first thing we notice is we do not have a chronologically arranged biography of the Buddha. So say you take the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, you have from the beginning of Jesus's birth, what he did through his life up to his execution. So that's chronologically arranged biography. There is nothing like this in the Pali Tipitaka. Okay. What we do have in the Pali Tipitaka is two brief chronologically arranged narratives. The first one starts from the time that the Buddha renounced his life of luxury up to the time that he arrived in Rajukaha after his enlightenment. So that is his renunciation, his studying with Alaraka Lama and Uddaka Ramaputta, his practice of his austerities, his enlightenment, his first sermon, and then going to Rajukaha and meeting or having an audience with King Bimbisara. So that takes about 7 years. So it's very briefly, very little detail, but it is chronologically arranged events taking up about 7 years. We do have that. Then we have in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta in the Digha Nikaya, we have another such chronologically arranged narrative. And it's from the last year of the Buddha's life, from the time he left Rajukaha on his final journey up to the time that he passed away in Kushinara. So that takes up about 12 months, maybe 13 months, okay? So here we have these two chronologically arranged accounts of the Buddha's, of certain events in the Buddha's life. Now, that leaves about 36 or 37 years in which we cannot know. We know what he did, we know where he did it, we know what he taught and who he taught to. But when he did those things, it is very, very difficult to find out, okay? But then the question is, what is a biography? Well, we usually think of a biography as a chronologically arranged account of a person's life, from their birth up to their passing away. But of course, a biography can take another approach. Without doing that, it can just tell you what that person was like as an individual, his habits, his routine, the people his early childhood experiences that molded his character, the people he interacted with, his likes and dislikes, etc. Now, in that sense, we do have a great deal of information about the Buddha. And in fact, the book that I am writing nowadays is based on just such information. Now, each of these pieces of information about what the Buddha was like, who he spoke to, what he ate, how he traveled, etc., we only have little scraps of information, but we have a huge amount of them. And when they're all put together, they present a picture of the Buddha as an extremely interesting and very human individual, and a very inspiring one, incidentally. So in a sense, we do have a biography of the Buddha, but not in the normal sense that that word is understood. Okay, so let's have a look at it. How does it start? Well, everybody knows that the Buddha was born in Kapilavastu. Legend tells us that this was a great city and that his father Suddhodana was a king. There is virtually no evidence of that from the Tipitaka. It's certainly possible that his father was a chief of the Sakyans, although only at a certain time. We know that the Sakyans had a body of elders, tribal elders, who elected from amongst themselves a leader. He may have been elected for a certain period of time. He may have stayed in that position for as long as he had their trust. But there is one place where his father is called a Raja, and then there are other places where he seems to be an ordinary citizen. And the word Raja at that time was starting to mean a king in the sense that we understand that word today. But at that time, it did not mean a king, or it did not only mean a king. Its older meaning was a chief or the head of the group. And that's probably what the Buddha's father was. We are told that Kapilavastu was a great city. Well, in the early 70s, Srivastava, a well-known archaeologist, identified for certainty Kapilavastu, and he excavated it, and it was probably nothing more than a large village. In fact, of the buildings and structures that were found there, none from the time of the Buddha were made of baked brick. Wattle and daub, probably. So in the Sakyan country, it was probably the biggest town. But as for a great city with a huge palace and city walls and that is certainly not the case. It was an obscure place, and probably we would know nothing about it if it wasn't for the fact that Gautama, the Buddha, was born there. Okay, so that's it. Now we move on to the Buddha's birth. Well, here we have some wonderful stories. So you will read, even in encyclopedias, his mother dreamed of a white elephant as she became pregnant. I've read that she was a virgin. Isn't that interesting? There's a story that he was born from his mother's right side. Quite a lot of these stories. It's interesting to note that none of these are in the Tipitaka. Now, I'm not saying that she didn't have a dream of a white elephant, or that she was not a virgin, or that he was not born from her right side. He may have been, she may have, but it is not recorded in the Pali Tipitaka. What does the Pali Tipitaka say about his birth? Well, not very much at all. There is one sutta, the Acharya Bhuta Dhamma Sutta, which is 123, the 123rd sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, which obviously is a rather late sutta, and it's full of the miracles that happened or supposed to have happened at the time Gautama was born. You can read it if you have Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of the Majjhima Nikaya. But it is interesting. One of the miracles that is supposed to have happened is this one, which I will read for you. When the Bodhisattva was born, a great immeasurable light, surpassing the splendor of the gods, shone forth into the world. And even in the empty gloom, the utter darkness between the world systems, where the light of our sun and moon, powerful and majestic though they be, cannot penetrate, even there did that light penetrate. And the beings that lived in that darkness became aware of each other because of that light. So that's from the Acharya Bhuta Dhamma Sutta. And you'll remember last time I talked about some of the other miracles that supposedly took place when the Buddha was born, that he took 7 steps and that a lotus popped out from each step he took. And I said that this is probably a metaphor for the 7 factors of enlightenment, and that this child would transcend samsara by attaining enlightenment. Well, if you think about this story, this light that is supposed to have shone forth as the Buddha was born, first of all, I think it is a wonderful account of the world systems and the intergalactic space in which a light shines because the Buddha was born, And beings who lived in that darkness became aware of each other for the first time. I take this to be a metaphor for the idea that the birth of Gautama Buddha would allow people, you and I and others in it, to become aware of each other. In other words, to become, or to have the possibility to become sympathetic towards each other because of the Buddha's teaching. So this may very well be another example of where if we use our creativity, some of the miracles that are supposed to have taken place around the Buddha may very well have a deeper and more important meaning than if we take them literally. Okay. The next thing that we know about the Buddha was that after he was born, a sage who lived in the Sakyan country, his name was Asita, heard that this child was born, and he went to Siddhartha, to Suddhodana's mansion to see the child. Okay. And Suddhodana handed him the child, and he supposedly, well, everybody knows the story, he predicted that this child would become either a great monarch or a great spiritual teacher. Now, that's what everybody knows. It's in all the books about the Buddha. Unfortunately, only a part of this story is in the Tipitaka. In the Tipitaka, Asita takes the child and predicts that he will become a great spiritual teacher. He doesn't say anything about becoming a great monarch. That is a later story. Now, the story itself might be legendary, but if you think about it, if Suddhodana was the chief of the Sakyans, or even if he wasn't the chief, if he was a big man in the country, it's only likely, it's very likely that the local holy man would come to bless that child. And of course, it's hardly likely that that holy man would say, well, the child's going to die in 6 months, or he's going to become a famous fashion designer or something like that. He wouldn't predict that. He'd predict that he'd become a great man. And because he himself was a holy man, he would predict that this child was going to become a great spiritual teacher. So while the story may very well be legendary, at least legendary in part, it's by no means impossible. Okay, so that's about it. When we then look through the Tipitaka to see what else it says about Siddhartha, Gautama's childhood, his youth, and his early adulthood, we find only 4 very brief references to what happened to him. Okay. Now, when we look at the legends, why, we have some wonderful ones. So, for example, probably the most famous and the most lovely of these stories is when, as a young child, Gautama, one day he found a goose. That is a wild goose that had been shot by an arrow. And then he picked up the bird, stroked it, calmed it, and then removed the arrow. And as he did that, his wicked cousin, Devadatta, came and said, that's my bird, I shot it, you give it to me. And Gautama, the young Gautama, refused to do that. They had an argument over them. So they decided to go to the Sakyan elders to let them arbitrate the disagreement. And Devadatta had his say. Now, I was walking through the forest with my bow and arrow, and I saw this goose and I shot it. And then when I went to retrieve it, Gautama had taken it and he wouldn't return it to me. I shot it, so it belongs to me. And then the elders asked the young Gautama, is that true? And he says, yes, that's true. And then they said, well, what do you have to say? And he said, well, To whom does the bird belong? To he who tries to take its life, or he who tries to save its life? They were impressed by his wisdom despite his youth, and they gave him the bird. So I think that is an absolutely wonderful story. And then we've got the story of the young man as a teenager winning an athletic contest. And as a result of that, he was given the hand of Yasodhara, and they were married. These are all popular stories. Unfortunately, none of them are in the Tipitaka. I'm really sad that the one about the goose is not, but I'm just telling, we're just looking at what the Tipitaka says, the oldest account of the Buddha's life. So what does the Tipitaka tell us about the Buddha's life from the time he was born to the time he renounced the world? Only 4 things. A brief reference to his luxurious life. It says that he had 3 mansions. And then most importantly, it says that, and it's an account by him himself. He is reminiscing about his youth, where he said once he was sitting under a tree watching his father work, and he spontaneously fell into a profound meditative state. And I think that is an extremely interesting story. It is not unknown in history that various individuals who went on to become great men or great women, particularly to become saintly people, had some sort of spontaneous oceanic feeling or something like that at some time in their life, which brought about a change in them. Anyway, that's what the Buddha said happened to him when he was young. And the other thing that he says in one place is that he gave some thought to the fact that he was born, he will grow old, and he will die. And that everything comes into being and persists for some time, then gets old, and then disappears. And then he said, he thought to himself, if that is the case, and I will be born, I've been born, I will live, and then I will die, and everything that I could search for is like that, should I not try to search for that thing, that element, or that state that is not born, that does not age, and that does not die? That's all he says. So these are the only 4 things that the Buddha tells us about himself from between the time that he was born up until the time he left his home to become a wandering ascetic. Then the next thing we know about the Buddha was, of course, we were told that his father didn't want him to become a great spiritual teacher. He wanted him to become a great monarch. And so to protect him from the ugly realities of life, he made available for him all sorts of sensual pleasures and women with musical instruments and the best food and everything and that, and sheltered from him the ugly realities of life. This is what the legend says. But that one day he managed to slip out of the palace, and he saw what is called the 4 sights. He saw an old man hobbling on a stick, a beggar diseased and in a terrible state, a corpse being taken for cremation, and then finally a wandering ascetic in a tawny or yellow robe. And he asked his companion, his charioteer, Jamna, what are those things? And because supposedly he'd never seen them before. And Channa said, well, it's old age, sickness, death. And the last of these foresights was that some people search for the state beyond those corporal states. And supposedly, or according to the legend, this is what made the young Gautama decide to renounce the world. Once again, it is an iconic story, but it's not found in the Tipitaka. But when we read in the Tipitaka where the Buddha is reminiscing about what he thought, that is, he was thinking about what is the meaning of birth and sickness and old age and death, it seems that somebody at some point has taken those words of him, and instead of talking about old age, he's replaced that with an old man. Instead of talking about sickness, he's replaced that with a diseased beggar. Instead of talking about death, he's replaced that with a corpse. So here we can see how a legend has evolved, probably in such a way as to be more understandable, nonetheless. Okay. So that's what the legend says. What does the Tipitaka say? Well, it says nothing about how the Buddha renounced his life of luxury and left his family, except one simple sentence. He says in the Majjhima Nikaya that he decided to leave his secular life despite the weeping and wailing of my parents. Now, the legend tells us that his father did everything he could to stop his son from finding about the realities of life, to the degree that he confined him in the palace. And so Gautama had to sneak away in the middle of the night. So that's what the legend says. He himself says that he left despite the weeping and wailing of his parents. Now, this suggests that they were fully aware that he was going. It suggests that there was perhaps arguments and pleading and raised voices, which would seem to be more realistic, and certainly that's what the Buddha himself says. So it seems very likely that at some point, having thought about the meaning of life and the ugly realities of conditioned existence, at some point he mentioned to his parents, that's it, I'm going in search of the truth. I intend to become a wandering ascetic to find the key to transcending the normal aspects of conditioned existence. Okay, so from that time onwards, we start to get quite a lot of information about what Gautama did. So it is clear from this that the great pundits who preserved and organized and then later edited what became the Tipitaka, they simply had virtually no interest in the Buddha's life until he became one of them, until he became a wandering ascetic. Because from that time onwards, we start to get quite a lot of information. And most of us will know what happened. So first of all, he mentions that he went to Rajukaha. He went from Kapilavastu to Rajukaha. And Rajukaha was the capital of the kingdom of Magadha. It was the biggest city of the time in the most powerful kingdom. And some of you may have been there. I've been there quite a few times. It's one of my favorite places, Buddhist places in India. Now, of course, the great city is all gone. There's just a few ruins. But it is enclosed by very high mountains, quite high mountains. And nowadays, where the great city once was, it is all forested. Now, in those mountains and beyond where the city was, there was forest, there were rock caves and rock shelters. And having a large population, it attracted the various ascetics, wandering sages and what have you. Why? Because there was a forest around and caves where they could stay. Secondly, there was a large population where they could go and beg for alms and get perhaps support and collect or gather around them disciples. So that would seem to be the reason why Gautama went there first. After that, he tells us that he visited his first teacher, Alara Kalama. That this man taught him first of all, he instructed him in the theory of his philosophy, and then taught him the various meditation techniques, which Gautama excelled at within a very short time. Then he went to Alara Kalama and told him that he had attained this state. Alara Kalama was incredibly impressed and offered to make him his co-teacher so that the two of them together could lead their little band of disciples. Gautama refused the offer because he was not content that the state that Alara Kalama taught as the highest state was indeed the highest state. So he thanked his teacher and he went in search of another teacher. And eventually he sat at the feet of a teacher called Udaka Ramaputta or Udaka Ramaputta. And pretty much the same thing happened there. Only in this case, Udaka was the son of a deceased teacher called Rama, who taught meditation leading up to a particular state. And Udaka had never actually attained that state. But he told a theory to Gautama. He put it into practice, and within a very short time, he attained that state. Udaka Ramaputta was so impressed that he offered to step aside and allow Gautama to become the teacher of himself and his disciples. Once again, Gautama thanked him but refused the offer, and then he wandered off by himself. And we are told for the next several years he decided on another approach. That is, that he decided to practice what was called Attakilamatana yoga, what would now be called severe self-denial, or what do you call it? Severe self-denial. And such practices were quite mainstream at that time, as they still are in some Hindu ascetic sects today. So there are several theories behind this. The main one was, at that time, in that group of people, the belief was that the more you subjected your body and your mind to stress, that this created something called tapasa, the heat, an ardor, a type of a heat. And this heat imparted to you a certain power over yourself and even over the external world. And so the idea was that the more you torture yourself, the more psychic power you would have. That was one theory. The Brahminical theory was that if you have committed some offense, that you have failed to practice the Vedic rituals, or that you have contravened some caste practices, that one way that you could make amends for this was to punish yourself. So that was another theory behind the idea of self-mortification. And the third theory, which was taught by the Jains and is mentioned in the Tipitaka itself, is this idea. Jainism, and maybe one or two other ascetic sects, taught that everything that happens to you, positive or negative, pleasant or unpleasant, is due to some thing you did in the past. So if you torture yourself, that's really got nothing to do with the fact that you're inflicting that upon yourself is irrelevant. That pain you're feeling must be because of something that you did in your past. So the more you torture yourself, the more you inflict stress on your body and the mind, the more you are able to eliminate your negative karma. Now, the Buddha does not tell us why he practiced self-mortification. It may have been for one or another of those reasons, perhaps another reason we don't know. But there are, in particular, two suttas in the Majjhima Nikaya where he describes in graphic detail the things he subjected himself to. Eating, fasting, sitting out in the sun or during the heat of the day, eating virtually nothing, squatting for hours on end, or standing, never sitting, all sorts of things. If you read in the Majjhima Nikaya, the descriptions are actually quite electrifying and very authentic. So it seems almost certain that absolutely certain that the Buddha actually did do these things. And he excelled at them, so much so that he started to attract not disciples, but companions, 5 of them in his case. It seems that they were so impressed by the extremity of his self-mortification that they were convinced that sooner or later he would attain some high state and they would be the first to receive it from him. And so they hung around him for some time. Now, once again, virtually everywhere you read that the Buddha practiced these self-mortifications for 6 years. That doesn't seem very likely. That would mean that he was only with his first teacher and his second teacher for a few weeks. But to attain the high states that he did, he must have been with them for at least a few months, probably quite a few months. So it's quite possible that he stayed with Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta for, let's say a year, or perhaps 2 years, or perhaps 18 months, which meant that he wouldn't have practiced these self-mortifications for 6 years. But we can say this, from the time that he went to his first teacher to the time he became enlightened, we could say that that was 6 years. So he practiced these self-mortifications, this self-denial for a long time until his body and mind gave out, couldn't take any more, and he collapsed. Reassessing his life up till that time, he decided that this was not working. What he was doing so far and what he was learning hadn't really moved him forward towards the goal that he sought. So he decided to give up. And when he did this, he says that he decided to wash and have a decent meal. And when he did this, his 5 disciples were disgusted. They accused him of betraying his high ideals, and in disgust, they left him. So this must have been a time of great difficulty for Gautama. He left his home to attain enlightenment. So far, he'd attained nothing, and even the people who had some faith in him had now left him. They had abandoned him. So he says that he decided then to look for something else. And he says that he went on a walking tour through Magadha. And eventually he arrived at a small village called Uruvela, which is now called Buddha Gaya. And when he looked at the countryside around there, he says that he found it really beautiful. Now that his mind was refreshed, that he'd regained some of his strength, he was impressed by the sylvine surroundings that he saw, and they seemed to be so much more attractive than the grim forests where he'd spent his time the last few years. There, he says, there was a clear river with clear flowing water. There was a lovely bank, and there was this village, Uruvela, nearby where he would go for alms. So he decided to sit down there and do his meditation. Now, even those who know absolutely nothing about Buddhism know that the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree. Well, in the Tipitaka, there are 7 accounts of the Buddha's enlightenment. Some of them detailed, some of them brief. Only 2 of them mention the Bodhi tree. And if we look at the suttas where it does mention the Bodhi tree, it looks like they are somewhat later suttas. So in most of the accounts of the Buddha's enlightenment, it just says that he sat down somewhere near Uruvela, that small village. Now, if you go to India today, if you go to Bihar today, if you go to Buddha Gaya today, and then you leave the town and walk across the river and just keep on walking to some of the villages away from all the tourists and pilgrims, you will notice one thing, that almost every village has somewhere near it or at its entrance a sacred tree, what they call a wishing tree. And this is usually either a banyan tree or a Bodhi tree, Ficus religiosa. And this would take the place of a shrine or a small temple. It's a living temple, if you like. And if you look at these trees, sometimes you see a red thread around the trunk. This is women have put these there in the hope of having a son. Sometimes you will see small offerings, little lamp or a little piece of incense at the foot of the tree. The local people will look upon that as sacred, and they will come and make offerings there on a regular basis. This is to be found in virtually every village in India. Now, as I said, in most of the accounts of the Buddha's enlightenment, it doesn't mention a tree. But it seems to me very, very likely that the Buddha would have sat near Uruvela's sacred tree. Why? Well, because he was an ascetic. He had to have food. He would have known that sooner or later, one of the villagers would come with some offerings. And when they saw him, they would either give him their offering if it was food, or if it wasn't food, they would go home and get some food and bring it for him. So although the early texts do not mention the Bodhi tree, I think it is quite credible that the Buddha would have sat under the Uruvela's local sacred tree. Incidentally, it's quite possible that a simple villager seeing him there might have actually thought that he was the spirit of the tree god, whatever. And then we get several accounts of what happened while of the Buddha's experience of enlightenment. We won't go into the details because some of those are somewhat complex. So he attained enlightenment. He says, aloko udapadi, light arose, vision arose, knowledge arose, understanding arose. And he changed from being Gautama the Sakyan to becoming Gautama the Buddha, the enlightened one, the Samma Sambuddha, the perfect and completely enlightened one. And then there are 2 accounts, both of them in the Vinaya. One says that he stayed around Uruvela for, I think it's 4 weeks. Another one, I think it says 6 weeks. There are 2 accounts of that. And then he decided he gave some thought to what he was going to do next. So there were two choices. One is that he could go off into the world and teach to others what he had realized. And the other one was that he could just find a nice place to live near a village somewhere and just spend the rest of his life experiencing the bliss of enlightenment. And so he decided that the first one would be the best option, because he says that if he tried to teach others what he had realized, they'd only argue with him, which turned out to be true, actually. And so he decided that he wasn't going to do that. Then, according to two of the accounts of his enlightenment, one of the highest deities from the Brahma world came down and impeached him not to do that, but rather to teach. So this made the Buddha reconsider. And he says that he looked out with his Buddha eye into the world, and he saw beings of all different types. They were like lotuses. Some of them, like a lotus, they germinated, but they never got beyond that. Some of them germinated and grew, but they never got to the surface of the water. Some of them got to the surface, but never opened. And a few germinated, grew, got to the surface, and then rose above the surface and opened. And he said that people were like that. Most of them never amount to anything. A few do. A few have understanding, or at least the potential for understanding. So for their sake, I will teach. I think that is a wonderful and highly meaningful story. So then he decided, well, if I'm going to teach, who am I going to teach to? And he decided that his two former teachers would be the most likely candidates. He discovered that both of them had passed away, so he decided that he would teach his 5 former disciples. He found out that they were staying near Benares or Varanasi. He went there, and to them he taught his first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. From then on, the Buddha's life, for the next 35, 36 years, the Tipitaka contains some 2,000, I think it is, discourses, ranging from very short to very long, in which he had dialogues or debates with different people, in which he taught his monks and his nuns. He interacted with all sorts of people, scholars and pundits, and from all levels of society. And many of the things that he said, the points that he made, are preserved for us in the various suttas. And as I said, where he taught these and to whom he taught them, and sometimes the events that triggered him to teach those things, we have a great deal of information. But as to actually when he did this, it's very hard to say. And perhaps it doesn't matter. Anyway, and then in the last year of the Buddha's life, we have a very detailed account of his last journey, which is about 300 kilometers, incidentally, from Rajgir to Kushinara. And it describes him taking about 10 months, 11 months to make that journey. For 3 months during the rainy season, he abided in Vaishali. It describes him as getting physically weaker and more exhausted. And then finally he arrived in Kushinara, and later that evening he passed away while lying between two great sal trees. So that's the life of the Buddha as preserved for us in the Pali Tipitaka. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that the Pali Tipitaka is the oldest and most authentic account we have of the Buddha's teaching. And I can see no reason why the core material in the Tipitaka does not date from his time, or at least from the first generation of Buddhist monks and nuns. But that is not to say that there is not some later material in there. There is. And sometimes we're actually told that it's later. For example, there is a sutta where Mahakatyana has a dialogue with the king of Mathura. And it specifically says in the sutta that this happened sometime after the Buddha had passed away. We have an account of the first council, which happened some maybe 3 or 4 months after the Buddha passed away. We have an account of the second council, which tradition says was convened about 100 years after he passed away. So it's clear that some material was being added later. But the core material in the Tipitaka, particularly in the four Nikayas, the Digha, the Majjhima, the Samyutta, and the Anguttara Nikaya, there's no reason to doubt that this is very authentic and very ancient. And then when we look at the Khuddaka Nikaya, the Udana, the Itivuttaka, the Dhammapada, the Sutta Nipata, these are probably very, very old and authentic also. So if we want to know about the Buddha, who he was, what he taught, it is to this body of literature that we have to look. Okay, that's all I have to say for this evening. I hope that some of the things I have said may be of interest to you. Thank you. Oh, one thing before I finish. Some time ago, I wrote a book in which I included a lot of the ideas that I've talked about tonight. It's all online. And if you go to this address or this link, there you will find about 450 topics related to virtually everything concerning the Buddha, his doctrine, life at the time of the Buddha, and so on. Just in case you didn't see it, it's www.bhantedhammika.net. You might find some of the things that I have written there interesting. And if there is nothing else, we'll finish for tonight. Thank you.